Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Belko and today I'm going to do a little bit of a ranger build. So this is going to be a quick start guide. If you're interested in playing the ranger and you want something that'll be relatively effective in both melee and range combat that's able to fulfill that striker and scout role for your party. So you're going to be able to find the traps, open the locks, sneak ahead, as well as deal with really useful or deal with those dangerous enemies and take them out in a round or two quickly in combat. So to start off, I did make a half elf and I put my points in dexterity and wisdom. These bonus 2 points in charisma, this is going to be going away in the release build, but I just like half elves because they're cool and I think it's really thematically popular race combo with a ranger, so I went for it. In terms of my origin, I selected Charlatan because it gives me proficiency in Deception and Sleight of Hand. Not that I plan on being the party face with this character, but it is a way to get the Sleight of Hand proficiency. I could also get that with Urchin, but because I already get Stealth proficiency from being a half-elf, that's just a little bit of a waste there. So I'm going to go to Charlatan and just get this bonus proficiency just in case I want to use it later. So let's talk about what a ranger can do. Now, this was by request. Somebody was asking how you could build out a melee capable ranger. There's actually multiple ways. I'm just going to show you the one I would generally like, but I'm going to talk about the couple of options you have. So you can actually make a strength based ranger or a dexterity based ranger. And I'm going to show you how you could do either one. The advantage of being a strength-based ranger is you're going to have a little bit better armor class once you have the gear to support it. And it's going to be a little bit easier to use your bonus action. You'll have a little bit more flexibility because a strength-based ranger can either use a sword and shield and go really in your face and almost be a bit of a front line. And then you also have your potential familiar or animal companion running around as well to really bog down the front line while still doing reasonable single target damage. Whereas a dexterity based ranger is going to have way more ranged options and is going to be able to use a bow a lot more effective, but they're going to be a little bit squishier, not too much squishier, but just a little bit squishier, and they're going to be a little bit starved for bonus actions and melee combat because you're going to be dual wielding as a dex based versus a strength based ranger who's most likely going to be using a big greatsword or something like that. So it does depend on what build you want to go with. So I'm going to show you those two options and how you start off. And then I'm going to eventually make the dex-based character. And I'm actually going to bring it up to level 3 just so you can kind of see some of the decision points and things you might want to make on the way. And hopefully following along, you'll be able to think about where you want to take your own character come release. So first up, there's a few things in terms of the favorite enemy that are obviously very different than the pen and paper version of the game. So in Baldur's Gate 3, they've definitely made changes to the Ranger, which has been traditionally a very situationally effective class. So right up, you can take Bounty Hunter, Keeper of the Veil, Magebreaker, Ranger Knight, or Sanctified Stalker. All of these are going to give you a skill proficiency and a minor bonus. So for example, Bounty Hunter gives you proficiency in investigation, and then you're going to get a bonus with your ensnaring strike. So if you're using ensnaring strike, enemies will have disadvantage on their saving throw. So if you want to be more of a frontline character, this is pretty good. It's fine on a ranged character as well, but the thing with ensnaring strike is it is going to be something that a lot of big beefy melee enemies are going to be really good at resisting at. So giving them disadvantage means you're going to be more likely to land it. And then using it on those slippery casters, it's actually going to be huge. And the thing that's nice about ensnaring strike is once an enemy is ensnared, all attack rolls against them have advantage and they're going to have disadvantage on all their dexterity saving throws. So it makes them really, really easy to hit. But this makes you more of like a supporting character. And the problem with ensnaring strike is it is concentration. So it's going to be competing with Hunter's Mark, which is sort of a bread and butter ranger spell that this is sort of the equivalent of your sneak attack or your hex that a warlock gets. And your Hunter's Mark is really the way the ranger gets to keep up in damage. So let's kind of look at some of these other ones. This is going to give you Arcana and Protection from Good and Evil, but also Protection from Good and Evil is a concentration spell, which is situational. It will be useful sometimes. However, because it's concentration, it's competing with Hunter's Mark. Magebreaker, this gives you, once again, a concentration spell with True Strike, The nice thing is you could potentially use this before combat starts, get your one attack off, and then get your Hunter's Mark rolling. However, a lot of times you might have Hunter's Mark left over from a previous encounter, and this won't be doing much for you. Ranger Knight. Now, this one's interesting. It gives you proficiency with heavy armor, which Rangers typically don't get. This actually allows you to be a strength-based ranger right out of the gate. So if you wanted to be a strength-based ranger, you could take that, and that would actually allow you to dump dexterity. And you could go down to, I would still maybe want like at least a 12 just for those odd initiative bonuses and better reflex saves and things like that, because it is still important for you. But this would allow you to, equip a greatsword, get in the front line, put on some chainmail or some plate mail, and absolutely still do great damage because you're going to use your bonus action for your Hunter's Mark and then bust out your greatsword and just start slapping things. It's not necessarily the traditional way we think of when we're playing a ranger, at least not in current 5th edition, but it definitely reminds me of how it felt like playing Minsk in Baldur's Gate 2, just rocking the greatsword and running in there. So if you're familiar with that ranger knight style, it is kind of fun. And then finally, Sanctified Stalker gives you this situational cantrip. It's not concentration though, so that's kind of nice, and it gives you proficiency with religion, which is like, really, these are kind of all flavored. They are all situational, so there isn't necessarily a best one. I kind of like the bounty hunter one because ensnaring strike just is a useful spell to have, and it gives you some options in terms of like locking down a tricky target. It does compete with your Hunter's Mark though, and it does definitely give you it kind of like pigeonholes you into taking ensnaring strike as a spell, which you don't necessarily need to take. So that's an option. Or like, let's pretend we're building out our strength character, so let's go with Ranger Knight for now. In terms of these natural explorers, you have some damage resistances, which are fine. You also have Urban Tracker that would get you that sleight of hand proficiency, but we already picked that up by being a charlatan. And then there's Beast Tamer, which gives you Find Familiar at level 1 right away for free, so you always have this little summon. And the summon's great. It can do a little bit of extra damage, and as a striker, having that extra little pet that can follow you around to do some damage is great, but a lot of times it's just going to take one hit and die in combat. But hey, using up an enemy's action for essentially free once per combat, that's totally fine. And between the Toad and the Raven, even being able to give enemies blindness or give them disadvantage on their attack rolls, there's some opportunity for it to actually survive a few rounds. You just send it up on an archer that's perched up somewhere, and you can actually have it be essentially take an enemy out of the fight for a couple of rounds. So I do really like the Find Familiar. So, and it is just fun to have a pet level 1. You have some great proficiencies early on in the game because medium armor is hard to come by. It's not like in the pen and paper game where you just get to start off with like some splint mail or something, for example, or scale mail or whatever it is. The Baldur's Gate, you get a set piece of equipment. I don't know if this changes on release, but in the early access, you get leather armor. So if you are going for a strength-based character, you're going to have really low AC and you're going to feel really, really squishy. So even if you are strength-based ranger, you're going to struggle a little bit until you just get like a little bit of equipment. In terms of our skills, we have some options here. Obviously, we want perception, and we get stealth for free. We also have all these other ones. We have a ton of skills already, so it's quite a few options. Perception is going to make us be that scout character that gets us in and finding traps and things like that. That's really great. And then the rest of them, I would say, like, pick what sounds interesting to you. If you want to be talking to animals, absolutely, rangers can get a spell that lets them speak with animals. So you might want animal handling, and you can talk to animals and do fun animal things. That could be fun. Athletics is great for shoving and being shoved. If you're a strength-based ranger, I would absolutely pick that one up. And then it's really up to you where you want the rest. But we have a ton of skills here, which is great. So really quickly, let's look at the 2 different ways you could build out a ranger in terms of your ability points. This is going to be your strength-based scores, roughly this. It doesn't have to necessarily be this exactly, and like I said, it's going to look different come release just because of the way ability scores work. But you're going to want your 16 in strength because it's going to be your primary attack attribute. and then at least I would say a 14 in Constitution. Try to aim for about a 14 in Wisdom, and then I don't love dumping Dexterity, so I put some remaining points in there. And then obviously Intelligence and Charisma are safe to lower as you will, and you could lower these even more, or if you wanted to be able to talk with your main character, you could do something like that a little bit, and then just dump Intelligence and have a little bit of Charisma, or even spread out some points in other places. But it's up to you how you'd spend the rest, but this is kind of the core of what you'd be going for. Now, if you wanted to make a Dexterity based character, you could absolutely be able to dump Strength, kick up your Dexterity. I would say you could even go a little bit further with your Wisdom, and then let's go into our race bonuses. Take that +1 out of the Strength, go into Dex, go to abilities, so we can get rid of it. We don't want a penalty in our Strength. We could have something like this. This looks really great for our Dexterity based character. So we have no penalty or bonus in Strength, a nice Dexterity modifier, a nice Wisdom modifier. This will make us even better of a Scout. Okay Intelligence, solid Constitution, and no penalty or bonus in Charisma. And this character would be very effective at ranged and melee combat because we have the high Dexterity. We'll be using 2 scimitars or 2 short swords and getting in there. And multiple attacks per turn is nice, a little bit of an even damage number. And then once you do have Hunter's Mark on a target, you will be chopping things up rather nicely. All right, so level 2, you've taken your ranger up, and now you're looking at getting spells and a fighting style. So there's a lot of interesting choices here, and I'm going to go over both what you would want to think about if you're going for a strength-based or a dexterity-based. We talked about making a melee character, so archery is very good, but it's +2 on your weapon attacks for range weapons. So obviously this kind of pigeonholes you into being an archer. So we're not necessarily going to take that, but it's still a great pickup. Absolutely great if you want to be that more ranged focused, but it does potentially hurt your potential as a melee focused character. Next, we can have defense, which is just going to give us +1 AC all the time. Not a bad pickup. As a melee character, as a skirmisher, getting in there, it's definitely worth picking up some more defense. I actually would consider this, even if I'm wanting to be a striker character that's going to do damage, because it is just staying alive longer means you're getting more rounds to do damage. Dueling is going to give you +2 damage if you're using a weapon in one hand and no weapon in the other hand. So sword and shield gives you an extra +2 damage with your main hand attack. This is actually pretty good for damage, and I'll talk about that in just a moment because we're going to compare it to 2-weapon fighting, which honestly can be a little bit of a trap, but it is fine. So 2-weapon fighting gives you, when you make an offhand attack, you get to add your ability modifier, which is good because we have a 16, we get +3. So if we're using 2 short swords, we're going to get a 2d6 +6 damage, which is not terrible. And then you're doing Hunter's Mark on top of that for another 1d6 when we're hitting. You can add Colossus Slayer at higher levels for the next level for another 1d8. And all of a sudden, yeah, you're doing a lot of damage with a ranger. But comparing 2-weapon fighting to dueling, it actually is really interesting. So 2-weapon fighting, an offhand attack means whenever you use your bonus action to make an attack, you get 1 extra attack by 2-weapon fighting throughout the entire game. And because you're a ranger and you're reapplying your Hunter's Mark, you're often going to be using your bonus action every other turn or so to reapply Hunter's Mark. So really you're getting 1 attack every other turn on average. Maybe, twice every 3 turns, let's say. So dueling is going to give you that +2 damage on every attack. Every round you're getting that +2. So in those 3 turns, you did 6 more damage. And if you got to use your bonus attack twice, you did 6 more damage. And you're like, okay, well, it's about equal. They're kind of the same. But here's the problem is when you're dueling, you also get to wear a shield, at least in the pen and paper version. I'm not sure if this works in Baldur's Gate 3, but I'm assuming it does. So you get to wear a shield, which is great. And here's the other thing you need to consider is 2-weapon fighting. Yes, it scales. So once you get your dexterity to 18, it'll be starting to do 4 damage. And this seems to not scale, except it kind of does, because at level 5, you actually get 2 attacks per round. So now you're doing this +2 damage twice. And this +2 damage also happens when you're making attacks of opportunity. So Dueling is actually very comparable to two-weapon fighting. The one advantage that two-weapon fighting has is sometimes you can cast a bigger spell with your main action. And the one thing in Baldur's Gate that's kind of interesting is you can actually make a ranged weapon attack with your bow, and as long as you still have a bonus action, you can use an offhand attack still. So that's one change in Baldur's Gate 3 that's pretty cool. And so two weapon fighting lets you do some serious damage with your offhand attacks. So it is still viable, but I don't want you to think like, oh, once I have 20 decks, like, +5 damage on my offhand seems way better than +2 damage on my main hand. This actually scales very well because of all the ways you get to use it, and it always adds. So the dueling is very good, and it is worth considering. But I'm going to go two-weapon fighting because I think that is like the classic ranger build. Dual wielding scimitars is a very classic ranger fantasy. And we're also going to talk about the spells. So you get a lot of spells at level 2 to choose from. You get another spell at level 3 to augment these. And the main takeaway for these spells is that you need Hunter's Mark. This is going to increase your weapon damage by an extra 1d6 whenever you hit with a weapon attack on your target. It has a decent range. It is concentration, and it takes a bonus action. So this is where if you're that strength-based character and you're using a two-hander or a sword and board and you've taken dueling, then this is going to be something you're going to be using all the time, obviously. Even if you're a ranged archer, you're putting this on your character and you're shooting them. As a two-weapon fighter, this is kind of where it's kind of sucks having two-weapon fighting, because if you're using dueling, you get that bonus on the first turn, whereas as a two-weapon fighter, you use your bonus action to cast Hunter's Mark, then you go up and hit them with your main hand, and then the next round you get to hit them twice. But once you are hitting them twice, Hunter's Mark definitely feels really good. A few other things to note is you have some speak with animals and animal friendship. These are not necessarily amazing. I mean, speak with animals is really fun for RP purposes, and Larian always has hilarious animal dialogues, so definitely worth picking up. You should have at least one character that can cast this. Probably better on like a druid or somebody who can swap it out. Rangers don't get to change their spells except for level ups. Another option I would consider taking on a ranger is maybe one of the heals, so you can pick up party members. Specifically, Cure Wounds allows you to do that. Goodberry gives you some berries that you can just pop as a bonus action to stay topped up. Hail of Thorns will give you a little bit of an AoE, and it still does damage even when you miss, so it actually can be really, really useful as if there's an enemy with like 1 HP left and you want to guarantee they get taken out. You can use Hail of Thorns because it will still do damage to them. And things like Jump and Longstrider are actually really useful in Baldur's Gate as well, compared to the tabletop version, because the battlefields can be really big and have lots of verticality. So being able to use these on yourself and then just get that extra movement so you can get into position, get the high ground, get that bonus to attack, it's really, really useful. And if you're playing a melee build like we're talking about for this character, being able to get in there and get on the flanks is going to be awesome. And the nice thing about both of these spells is they do not take your concentration. So you can cast one of these before combat. Longstrider actually lasts until a long rest, whereas Jump is only 10 turns. Cast one of these before combat, then open up with a melee or a range shot, and then run in there. So this is really what we're thinking about, is not taking a spell that's going to compete with our concentration, especially at level 2. So that is all the things you might want to think about for level 2. Definitely take Hunter's Mark, and then do you want something like Hail of Thorns for AoE options? Do you want some mobility options? Do you want the fun RP, or do you want some healing? And then obviously I skipped over Ensnaring Strike and Fog Cloud. They are fine spells. This gives you some battlefield control, which is actually really useful. Doesn't require a saving throw. It's just an obscuring mist, but you'll notice it's concentration, so that's why I didn't really take it. On to level 3. So whether you're a strength or a dexterity-based ranger, you have a couple of options, and I'm going to talk about the 2 that are available in the early access. There is a third coming in release, but we won't talk about that now. I might update this video or make a few new videos when I have the full game at my fingertips. But I mean, most of us are probably all going to be playing, and I don't know how much of us are going to be watching updated content post-release, but that's okay for now. This is fun. So we have the subclass of the Hunter and the Beastmaster. The Hunter gives us Colossus Slayer, Giant Killer, and Horde Breaker. Colossus Slayer is going to give us additional damage when we're attacking enemies that are already damaged, so below maximum hit points. This is great for that single target striker roll. It helps you finish off enemies, gives you a little bit of extra bonus damage once per round. So an extra D8 once per round is totally reasonable. The situation of not being full health, this is really easy to achieve after the first round of combat. There's usually always a couple of enemies that you can choose from that are injured, and you just put your hunter's mark on them, and then you almost kill them in one hit or a couple of rounds, and then go on to the next. So your job as this kind of ranger is to, isolate a target, pick something that's injured, hunter's mark, kill it. Colossus Slayer, great pick. Giant Killer is more for the frontline ranger. It's not great if you're 2-weapon fighting like we would be. If you are going to be an archer, it's not great, but it is absolutely fine if you're that strength-based ranger, that ranger knight with the big two-hander, and you're going to be making reaction attacks against creatures. That'll be totally great. Horde Breaker is a solid option if you want to be either melee or ranged, or if you're like our build, capable of doing both, because it lets you just attack 2 enemies if they're close to each other, whether it's at range or melee. And this happens reasonably often with enemies being near each other, and just being able to do this every round is actually pretty good. So this is a solid option as well. Obviously not quite as focused on striking in terms of like single target damage, which if that's what you're trying to pick as your role, Colossus Slayer would probably still be better for that. Let's talk about the Beastmaster though. So the Beastmaster in some ways is an even better striker and potentially even a better frontline because it gives you another body. So you get to summon an animal companion and it acts during your initiative. And unlike the tabletop Beastmaster where like you're using your turn or your actions to like command your pet to make attacks, you still get your action as a character and bonus action. And then the pet just makes its own attacks. The pets aren't super strong, but they're strong enough and they just do extra damage. And at the end of the day, a lot of times you're going to get more use out of it than an extra 1d8 of damage. And just the fact that it provides an extra body on the battlefield, you can summon them back. You have options of how you want to change it up for each situation. The Beastmaster is really fun, and it does sort of really help you fulfill that ranger class fantasy of like having all your nature pets with you, and you can be a really useful pet class. So in terms of building out your character, this would be good for either strength or dex. As a frontline character, you could be sending in your dire raven to the back line to harass casters. If you are a more dexterity focused ranger and you're skirmishing, you could potentially send your bear out to flank or your wolf out to flank, knock enemies prone, and then you're in there dual wielding, getting a whole bunch of advantage on all your weapon attacks. So really useful as a Beastmaster for any build of Ranger, and it is just super iconic, so I would highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. Larian has definitely put in a lot of work with the animal companions, and they are way better than in the tabletop version of the game. In terms of spells, you don't get any new spells. You can replace one if you don't like it. You get one additional spell, but it's still first level Ranger spells, so we already talked about those at level 2, so I won't look at them now. And yeah, that's sort of like the first 3 levels of Ranger. You're making a lot of decisions. You can go either strength or dexterity based. I prefer dexterity based just because I like having the options to be a bit more of a ranged character. But even if you are a completely strength based character and you've dumped dexterity, you're still going to be able to like throw javelins and, you have a lot of mobility. You'll still do fine in combat. All right, and as a final piece of our Ranger quick build guide, let's talk a little bit about multiclassing. So multiclassing is going to be available at launch, and this is going to allow us to pick up a couple of extra cool little abilities that might synergize with the Ranger toolkit. And if we are interested in building a striker, there's a few options we might want to consider. So I'm not going to go over every single multi-class because that would be crazy, but let's talk about just a couple things that you might want to consider for being a ranger. So if you're a melee ranger, fighter is obviously a great pickup. So fighter gives you another fighting style, right away at level 1. It also, so this would let you potentially consider taking like protection in addition to 2-weapon fighting, or if you wanted to be that strength-based character, you could have great weapon fighting as well as protection, and that would be a great way, or not protection, sorry, defense and great weapon fighting. So you could be a little bit tankier as a front line. And if you take 2 levels of fighter, another thing you would get would be Action Surge, which is a really, really powerful ability. Almost every class, really almost any class, likes having the access to Action Surge. So when you're multi-classing a ranger, 2 levels of fighter could be a worthwhile dip. The one thing to consider, though, is whenever you're not taking ranger levels or caster levels, you are going to lose out on spell slots for your ranger spells. So there is a little bit of a sacrifice there. But speaking of spell slots, another class you might want to consider is a cleric. So clerics are great because they get their subclass at level 1. And it's not in early access. You only have access to a few, but you can take the War Domain subclass. And if you take a couple levels as a War Domain cleric, not only is that going to give you a few additional spells, namely something like Healing Word that lets you be even more of a healer kind of supporting character. It also gives you access to something like Bless, not that you really want to be the Bless bot if you are a striker character, but the main thing you're looking for is if you have Channel Divinity as a War Cleric, you get to add +10 to certain attack rolls. So it is limited based on the Channel Divinity feature, I believe, but it would give you that option to really dish things out. And War Domain clerics also can use bonus actions to make additional attacks a limited number of times. So right away even. So even if you dipped into War Cleric early on before you hit 5th level in Ranger, you could still, for the most part, do a few extra attacks. But whenever you're multi-classing as a martial class, you usually want to get to the point where you're getting additional attacks right away. So for example, Rangers get an additional attack at level 5. These don't really stack unless you're going deep into fighter. If you're 11th level fighter, you can make 3 attacks with 1 action. But otherwise, most martial classes, so the Barbarian, Paladin, Ranger, Fighter, etc., get an additional attack at level 5. So this is something to consider. You don't necessarily want to multi-class as a Ranger before level 5, but if you chose to do a War Cleric, you would get some cool benefits, some more extra spells and extra abilities like that as well. So a War Cleric is absolutely worth considering. And another one you could consider is multi-classing into a rogue. This gets you a little bit more skill options. It also gives you sneak attack. So this is something that's going to increase your ability as a striker a little bit. You can use your bow, or you can use your finesse weapons, your light finesse weapons with this. So you could still sneak attack with short swords and scimitars. You wouldn't be able to sneak attack as a strength-based ranger, so rogue isn't necessarily going to be the option. And if you do a couple of levels into rogue, you can get some skill expertise as well, making you even better as that scout. So those are sort of the things I would think about in terms of multi-classing, either a fighter for a couple of levels, a cleric, or a rogue. You could also even think about going for a druid. This would definitely make you more of a spellcaster. You have a little bit more of a spell list, but druids and clerics also use your same spell list as a ranger. So, sorry, not same spell list, but the same spell casting stat. So your wisdom, which you already have a good amount of, meaning these prepared spells you would get as a druid or a cleric would actually still be moderately effective. You just wouldn't have too high of spells unless you really went like level 5 ranger and then put the rest into druid or something. And then you would be more of like a druid that also just happens to have like reasonable ranged attack damage. And it would limit your really high end game spells, but you would still be moderately powerful and you'd still have a decent number of spells because rangers still are a partial spellcaster. And yeah, that is my way too long quick build guide for the ranger, going over the first 3 levels if you want to make a striker / scout character that is capable in both melee and ranged combat. That is how I would do it, focusing in on dex, eventually taking Beastmaster to give me that flexibility, and using either two-weapon fighting or archery, depending on if you want to be more ranged or more melee. But the request was for a melee build, so I would recommend two-weapon fighting for that, or even duelist if you would like to go sword and board and just be a little bit tankier. So yeah, thanks for watching. I appreciate all the support, and I will catch you in the next one.